Gold. That was the only word on the minds of the Persian soldiers as they poked torches into the pitch darkness beneath the temple of Marduk. Babylon, the city of legendary hanging gardens and unimaginable treasures, had fallen. Above ground, the empire was changing hands. Below ground, history was being plundered. The air was stifling. A mixture of millenniums of dust stirred up, and the acrid smell of smoke from the fires still smoldering above. Every step they took was a violation. Every sound echoed in the centuries-old silence. They were vultures of war, and they were searching for the carcasses of a rich empire. Their captain, a man named Arash, whose face looked like it was chiseled from sandstone and scarred by dozens of battles, beckoned them deeper. He did not believe in Babylonian ghost stories. He trusted only the weight of the gold in his pockets. They passed through corridors decorated with faded reliefs depicting gods and cosmic battles. But here, deep underground, there was no grandeur, only oblivion. "Sir, here," a young soldier named Kaveh called out. His voice did not have the excitement of someone who had found treasure. It had the hesitation of someone who had stumbled upon something forbidden. Kaveh was standing by a pit that had clearly been the temple's refused dump. There were broken pottery inscribed with the names of minor gods, rotten pieces of wood that had once been furniture, and piles of bronze slag from the foundry. His shovel had hit something hard. Arash stepped forward, frowning. "Gold doesn't ring like that," he muttered. The sound was deep, hollow, and somehow organic. Arash motioned for the others to raise their torches closer. He knelt, brushing away dirt and debris with his bare, calloused hands. Silence fell over the group as what they sought came into view. Its color was not the warm gold of precious metal. It was an unmistakable off-white, spongy, and unmistakable. Bones. Bones so small they made one's chest tighten. A hand with tiny fingers. A fragile ribcage. A rounded skull, still intact. The skeleton of a child. A heavy silence fell. These men had slaughtered entire armies without blinking an eye. They had seen the most horrific scenes war could produce. But this was different. It was not the violence of the battlefield. It was a silent cruelty, a crime deliberately buried in the enemy's most sacred place. The real horror began as the torchlight spread. Scattered like autumn leaves around the small skeleton were dozens of clay tablets. They had not been carefully arranged like burial objects. They had been thrown haphazardly, as if the undertaker had intended to dispose of them along with a terrible secret. Arash picked one up carefully. Its surface was rough, and the cuneiform writing was deeply and hastily inscribed. This was not the work of a professional scribe. This was the work of a man in a state of panic. A scholar had been summoned from the army. He squinted in the torchlight, tracing the characters with a trembling finger. "What does it say?" Arash asked, his voice low. The scholar swallowed. "Sir, it says, 'He is below.'" He picked up another tablet, closer to the skull. "This one says, 'Do not awaken the sleeping one.'" Another soldier found a tablet half buried in the dirt. The message on it was even more ominous. "The 13th moon will bring him back." The group looked at each other. The words made no sense in the context of an ordinary tomb. This was no memorial. This was a warning, a seal, a curse. They had come here seeking the material riches of Babylon. Instead, they had unearthed its spiritual fear. They had touched a wound that the empire itself had tried to hide at all costs. The Persian general who led the expedition was later informed of the discovery. He, a practical man, initially dismissed it as a strange local custom. But as other reports began to pour in from around the temple, of rooms sealed with molten lead, of corridors that seemed to change position, and especially of the image of a disfigured boy who kept reappearing on the wall of the throne room despite being chiseled away several times, he began to understand. The fall of Babylon was more than a military victory. It was the end of a city that had long been eaten away by an internal disease. To understand that disease, to understand how the remains of a child could be the darkest secret of an empire, we must leave the ashes of 539 BC. We must turn back the wheel of time, back 13 years, to a time when the walls of Babylon were still strong, when festivals were still in full swing, and when the child in the cesspool was still a boy named Shamash, who had a loving family and a terrible fate awaited him beyond the doors of the temple. 13 years earlier, Babylon had been a symphony of life. Its streets were rivers of people, its bazaars oceans of sound and color. The smell of baking bread mingled with the scent of oriental spices. The clanging of coppersmith hammers accompanied the haggling of carpet sellers. And in a small house, tucked away behind the bazaar, Shamash-Shidi lived a life he thought would last forever. He was 13, the age when the world began to open up. His biggest worry was whether his father would let him help in the family grain store. He wanted to feel the weight of the sacks of barley, to learn his father's math, to feel like a man. That morning, he and his younger sister, a little girl named Ishtar who held a small wooden bird, were grinding barley in the yard. The sun was warm, and the birds were chirping. It was a perfect picture of peace, a picture that was about to be torn apart. Their arrival made no noise, but the whole neighborhood fell silent. The temple delegation, 3 priests in immaculate white robes, unwrinkled, walked with a dignity that made others bow. They were followed by 2 temple guards, their muscles rippling under their leather armor, but their weapons were not the most terrifying thing. What was most terrifying was the blankness of their faces. And last, she, the chosen one. No one knew her true name. She was more a being than a person, a ghost that walked in the daytime. Her eyes had seen too much, and now reflected nothing. The small bronze bells hanging from her belt tinkled with each step, a mournful music that every mother in Babylon knew by heart. When they stopped at Shamash-Shidi's door, the neighbors outside rushed back inside. Windows slammed shut. The silence was not indifference. It was complicity in fear. Everyone knew the rules. The first rule, when the bell stops at your door, prepare for loss. The second rule, never ask why. Shamash-Shidi's mother appeared at the door, her hands still covered in flour. When she saw the delegation, her smile vanished, and her face turned as white as the flour itself. She knew what they had come for. The whispers had been circulating for years, of the honor of serving the gods in secret rituals, of children marked by heaven, pure virgin boys, chosen ones who would never return. "We come to do the will of Marduk," the head priest said, his voice flat and unsympathetic. "We seek the chosen one." The chosen one said nothing. She entered the small house, her eyes sweeping over the children. She swept over the younger sister, Ishtar, too young. She swept over the eldest brother, newly wed, no longer pure. Then her eyes settled on Shamash-Shidi. The boy stood there, stunned, the pestle still in his hand. "This one," she said, only 2 words, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. The world shattered. His mother rushed forward, fell to her knees, hugged the priest's feet, begged, cried. His father, a large man, rushed out from behind the house. He tried to reason. "He's just a child. He needs to learn my trade." When reason failed, he desperately pressed the last of the family's silver coins into the priest's hand. "Please, choose another child." The priest slapped his hand away, the coins clattering to the ground, a pitiful little sound. Finally, the father roared, the threat of a man cornered. The 2 guards immediately put their hands on the hilts of their swords. "You should be honored," the priest repeated, impatience beginning to creep into his voice. "Your son's sacrifice will ensure the prosperity of Babylon." But the words could not hide the truth. Shamash-Shidi was dragged away. He felt his mother's fingers digging into his ankles, a last desperate effort. Then the strong hands of the guards lifted him. His mother's scream echoed behind him, the sound of his soul being torn apart. It would be his last memory of home. On the way to the temple, the world seemed to be saying goodbye to him. He tried to inhale the scent of baking bread from a familiar bakery. He tried to listen to the noisy haggling of the market. He passed the stall of his best friend, Enlil's family. Their eyes met for just a moment. He saw the fear and confusion in his friend's eyes before Enlil's father yanked him inside. The message was clear: you no longer existed. As they approached the temple complex, the massive ziggurat towered like an artificial mountain, a symbol of ambition and power. But they did not enter through the main gate. They turned into a side passage, dark and narrow. The wooden door was small, unadorned, guarded by soldiers without insignia. It opened, revealing deep darkness. As the gates slammed shut behind him, the noise of Babylon faded, replaced by the silence of the tomb. Shamash-Shidi did not know what he would face, but he knew one thing for certain. The boy Shamash-Shidi, the son of a grain seller, had died on this very threshold. What had entered the darkness was something else. A vessel. The 13th. The air inside hit him like a wall. The scent of incense was thick enough to be almost liquid, mixed with myrrh and a sharp metallic scent, the scent of old, dried blood. The hallway was so narrow that his shoulder brushed against the cold stone walls. The light from the oil lamps hanging on the walls danced, casting long, distorted shadows like writhing, trapped souls. The walls were covered with cuneiform inscriptions, but they were not like the ones he had seen in the market. They seemed older, more angular, and seemed to pulse in the flickering light. They went down. It seemed like forever. Their footsteps were the only sound, a steady rhythm that led him farther and farther away from the world of the living. Finally, the chosen one stopped before a simple wooden door and commanded, "Wait here." She left him alone in a small, empty stone room. The silence stretched on for several minutes, long enough for fear to begin to gnaw at his mind. Then he heard them. Voices. They came from behind a wall. Children's voices, but they weren't laughing or talking. They were chanting the same phrase over and over again in a harsh, raspy language he'd never heard before. The sound wasn't melodious. It was harsh, monotonous, and it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't the language of men. It was the language of stone and dust. The door creaked open. Another boy entered. He looked a year or two older than Shamash-Shidi, but his eyes bore the weight of decades. His head was shaved, and the rough brown robes did little to hide his protruding ribs. His expression was blank, but when he saw Shamash-Shidi, a flash of recognition flashed. "Newbie," the boy asked, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat. I was Marduk Nasir. Don't use your name here. They don't like it." He glanced nervously down the hall. "Come on. They'll want to clean you first. The quicker the better." "Clean?" Shamash-Shidi asked, his voice trembling. Marduk Nasir smiled mirthlessly. "That's the word they use. It means destroying everything you once were." Marduk Nasir led him through a maze of corridors even more intricate than before. "The first rule," he whispered, his voice urgent, "is to forget the outside world. Your mother, your father, your sister, they no longer exist. Remembering them only brings pain, and they will use that pain against you." They passed through small rooms like cells. In each room, there were one or two boys. They didn't talk. They didn't move much. One sat staring at a blank wall, eyes vacant. Another rocked back and forth, clutching something to his chest. And then Shamash-Shidi saw them, scratches in the stone walls. At first he thought they were just random scratches, but when he looked closer, he recognized the pattern. Fingernails. Hundreds, thousands of desperate fingernails trying to claw their way through solid stone, searching for a way out that never existed. "Don't look," Marduk Nasir hissed, pulling him away. And the second and most important rule: never, ever ask about people who are no longer here. They never existed. Understand? They entered a slightly larger room. 6 other boys were sitting in a circle on the floor. They all had the same appearance: shaved heads, brown robes, thin bodies, and vacant eyes. They looked up as Shamash-Shidi and Marduk Nasir entered. In their eyes, Shamash-Shidi saw a strange mixture of pity and relief. Pity for him, the newcomer, who did not yet know the full horrors of this place. And relief, because his presence meant that the monk's attention would be temporarily divided. At that moment, a priest entered. He wore a bronze mask shaped like the face of a bird of prey, with a hooked beak and empty eyes. Immediately, the 8 boys, including Marduk Nasir, fell to the floor, 4 heads touching the ground. Shamash-Shidi, still bewildered by it all, stood alone. The monk's bronze head turned slowly toward him. He said nothing for a long moment, just tilted his head, watching him like a predator sizing up its prey. The silence was long, heavy. Finally, a voice spoke from behind the mask, a voice like the grinding of stones. "You will learn," he said. They all learned. The purification process began immediately. They stripped him of his clothes and threw them into a furnace. They shaved off every hair on his body with a sharp bronze blade. They immersed him in a tub of water that smelled of lotus flowers and old blood. They took away his name, declaring that from now on he was nothing more than a vessel. Hours of chanting followed. Meaningless words, repeated over and over again, designed to wear down the will and erase the memory. Shamash-Iddi tried to resist, tried to cling to the image of his mother, but the monotonous rhythm of the chanting was like waves crashing relentlessly against a cliff, slowly eroding it. That night, the boy Marduk Nasir disappeared. In the evening, he was still there, whispering his last warnings to Shamash-Iddi. The next morning, his place was empty. When Shamash-Iddi Jongjug Danzig asked another boy, he just looked straight ahead and answered mechanically. There are only 8 containers. There have always been only 8 containers. Shamash-Iddi felt a chill run down his spine. He understood. This place didn't just take away your name, your clothes, or your memories. It took away your very existence. You could be erased from existence at any moment, and no one would be allowed to remember that you had ever been there. It was the absolute annihilation of identity, and his cleansing had only just begun. I'll pause here to make sure you're happy with the direction and level of detail. If you agree, I'll continue writing subsequent chapters of similar length and depth to reach the 6,000-word goal. The real preparation was not an event, but a process. A scientific, calculated process of mind eroding. It began with the theft of sleep. The first night without sleep, Shamash-Iddi and the other boys felt tired but alert, their wills still a wall. The second night, fatigue began to gnaw at them. Thoughts became fragmented. By the third night, reality began to warp. Shamash-Iddi saw patterns on the stone floor move like snakes, and the monks' chants began to sound like the whispers of the dead. The monks, masters of psychological torture, watched them carefully. They didn't just want to exhaust them. They wanted to break the barrier between their inner and outer worlds. They wanted their minds to become pliable like wet clay, ready to be molded. 6 days without sleep, and the walls of the underground prison began to breathe audibly. Shamash-Iddi saw shadowy faces in the darkness, heard voices whispering secrets in a language that predates humanity. He no longer knew whether he was awake or dreaming. At the same time, the monks began to exploit individual fears. They had a terrifying ability to see into the hearts of individual boys. One boy, Sinlekianini, the son of a fisherman, was afraid of the dark. The monks locked him in a dark room for 2 days. His screams echoed through the corridors, a reminder to the others of their helplessness. When they pulled him out, he was no longer screaming. He was silent, his eyes wide open, staring into an invisible darkness that only he could see. They discovered Shamash-Iddi's weakness almost by accident, but they exploited it with deliberate cruelty. On the 7th night of his sleepless nights, when his mind was as thin as paper, they brought out a wooden box. The priest in the raptor mask explained that this was the final step in the purification, burning all mementos, severing all ties to the old world. Each item was pulled out and thrown into a blazing furnace. A wooden spinning top, a polished pebble, a piece of embroidered cloth. Shamash-Iddi watched blankly, his mind too tired to care. Then he saw it. It lay at the bottom of the box. A small wooden bird, carved clumsily by a child's hand. He recognized it at once. It was his sister Ishtar's favorite toy. He remembered the image of her clutching it to her chest when the temple delegation arrived. A memory he had tried to bury, now surfacing with irresistible force. No, a hoarse sound escaped his throat. The monk picked up the wooden bird and held it up to the fire. No! Shamash-Iddi screamed, a scream that came from the depths of his soul. His last defense had collapsed. He rushed toward the fire, an act of desperate, instinctive resistance. He no longer cared about the monks, about punishment. He only wanted to save the last fragment of a world he had lost. The 2 guards held him down easily. He struggled in their arms, watching helplessly as the wooden bird caught fire, turned black, and crumbled to ash. As the flames consumed it, he felt something inside him die. He stopped struggling. He stopped screaming. He just stood there empty. The masked monk nodded in satisfaction. "Ready," he said. When the remaining 7 boys had become hollow, mechanically obedient shells, the priests finally decided that they were worthy to know the truth. They were led deeper into the complex, to a door Shamashidi had never seen before. It was made of polished black stone and had no handle. The 3 highest priests, including the high priest, each held a differently shaped key. They inserted the key into 3 hidden locks simultaneously. The heavy stone door slid silently aside, revealing a cold darkness. A cold air poured out, carrying the scent of damp stone, myrrh, and something else, the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. The chamber within was circular and seemed to have been carved from a single block of black stone. It was unlike any stone in Mesopotamia. Its surface did not reflect light, but seemed to swallow it. The walls curved upwards and disappeared into darkness, covered with wedge-shaped symbols that emitted a faint glow, making them seem to twitch. Along the walls hung neatly bronzed tools, oddly shaped hooks, blades of varying curvature, and coils of thin chain. All had dark stains, evidence of repeated use. But it was the center of the chamber that made the boys hold their breath. A pit. It was 8 feet wide, lined with the same black stone, and it was deep. No one could see its bottom. The air above the pit seemed to vibrate, shimmering like desert air on a hot day, though the room was so cold that their breaths formed white wisps. "Behold," the high priest said. His mask was more elaborate than the others, a strange combination of bird, beast, and unnameable geometry. His voice echoed in the room. The mouth of Tiamat, the wound of creation, the gate. He began his lecture, not as a torturer, but as a theologian, a scientist of taboos. "You are taught that the great Marduk conquered Tiamat, the mother of chaos, and used her body to create the heavens and the earth," he said. "That is the story we tell our people. A simple tale of order triumphing over chaos. But the truth is more complex. You cannot kill chaos. You can only bind it. This pit is not a pit. It is a scar in the fabric of reality, where Tiamat's essence still oozes. It is a portal, and it has a hunger." He walked around the hole, the boys backing away at every step he took. Every 13 moon cycles, the veil between worlds thins. This scar breathes more strongly, and its hunger could swallow this entire city, dragging it back into the primordial chaos. So we must feed it, but it does not feed on mundane things. The blood of soldiers, the sacrifices of animals, those things are too impure. It craves purity, primal suffering, the energy released from a pure mind when it is broken. He gestured to the instruments on the wall. These are not torture devices. These are musical instruments. Each blade is designed to open a specific energy channel. Each hook is used to suspend your body at a precise angle, so that your suffering resonates with the frequency of the portal. You will not die immediately. Death will be a waste of energy. Your life, your suffering, will become the anchor to reality, the bridge through which we can perform the binding ritual, keeping Tiamat asleep for another cycle. One of the boys, the youngest, began to sob. The high priest looked at him coldly. "Tears are good," he observed. "Salt and sorrow. Both are powerful in the binding ritual." Then he said one last sentence, one that extinguished any remaining hope in the souls of the 7 boys. "You may wonder about the fate of your predecessors. The lucky ones will die on this altar. The less fortunate will become useful in other ways." He smiled behind his mask. "Your 3 predecessors are still serving down there, part of the bondage mechanism. Would you like to hear them perform?" No one answered. The silence in the room was heavier than the black stone that had formed it. The boys knew their fate, and it was worse than death. Knowledge of fate did not bring peace. It only opened the door to a new kind of torture. Now the boys were not only tortured by the priests, they began to be tortured by their own bodies. For Shamashidi, the nightmare began with his spine. It was no longer a dull ache. It was a violent restructuring. Every morning he woke with the feeling that his bones had shifted during the night, taking on new angles, unnatural curves. The pain was sharp and stabbing, but the priests would not let him rest. Instead, they forced him to walk in endless circles around the ritual chamber, each step a torture that forced his spine to adapt, to bend into a sickly architecture. Do not fight it, a monk whispered in his ear during one of his tests. Your body is wiser than you. It knows what shape it needs to take to resonate with the portal. Your pain is only the resistance of your weak human side. Give it up, and you will find peace in purpose. But there was no relief. Shamashidi's legs began to weaken. Their muscles atrophied, not from lack of exercise, but as if the life were being sucked out of them and into his increasingly deformed spine. At first, he had to hold on to the wall to walk. Then he had to crawl. By the third day of this deterioration, his legs were pale stalks, unable to support their own weight. The monks took notes with delight. Roots, one noted on a clay tablet. They are growing roots in preparation for the descent. Indeed, when they dragged him to the edge of the pit and left his legs dangling in the air, they suddenly stiffened, stretching downward as if searching for something in the deep darkness. At the same time, a sickly green glow began to appear on his skin. It started at the tips of his fingers and toes and gradually spread inward. It was not a sickly green, but a light of its own, a ghostly bioluminescence. In the darkness of the cell, his body emitted a faint glow, casting shadows on the stone walls that moved independently of his body. He had become a living lantern, lit by his own decay. The transformation of the other boys followed equally horrifying plots. The boy Sinlekianini, who was afraid of the dark, had his skin begin to thin. Day by day, it became more transparent. First, people could see faint blue veins. Then his internal organs pulsing weakly. Finally, people could see through him, seeing his altered bone structure and a nervous system that emitted faint rays of light like shooting stars. He had become a living window, a hideous display of the fragility of the human body in the face of inhuman forces. The boy with the abnormal joints now moved in ways that were completely unnatural. He could bend his arms in 3 points and turn his head in a near-complete circle. The monks forced him into impossible human poses, ones that they said pleasing the geometry of the portal. His every movement was a violation of the laws of nature, and the creaking of his joints became part of a creepy underground symphony. Shamashidi's perception was torn as well. The ability to see through the stone walls was not a gift, but a curse. He saw invisible energy pathways running through the temple, all converging on the pit. He saw the ghosts of dozens of boys who had died before, still repeating their last acts in eternal torment. And he saw Nergaldan, the boy who had tried to escape. He was not dead. The priest had found another use for him. They had incorporated him into one of the main walls of the temple, his twisted body becoming part of the spiritual system, a living conduit for the energies of the surface rituals to the vaults below. Nergaldan's eyes, peering through the translucent stone, met Shamashidi's. No words were spoken, but the plea for death was unmistakable. Their diet also changed dramatically. They could no longer eat normal food, but they began to crave lotus petals soaked in the viscous black oil that was scooped up from the pit. The oil tasted sweet and salty, and it eased the pain of the transformation, but also hastened it. They had become addicted to the very thing that was destroying them. Your ripeness is perfect, the high priest observed during one examination, as he examined Shamashidi's spine, now curved into a shape identical to one of the sacred symbols on the wall. Like fruit for harvest, sweet suffering to attract the hungry below. The boy with the transparent skin was the first to ripen. His body was now a complete bioluminescent map. The priests declared him ready. They led him to the ritual chamber, wrapping thin copper wires around his transparent body. The copper bit into his flesh, creating tiny green sparks. They laid him across the edge of the pit, his limbs stretched. Then they began to chant, another chant, deeper and deeper. Shamashidi and the other 2 boys were forced to watch. They saw the air above the pit begin to vibrate more intensely. An invisible pressure pressed down on the room. Something from below was straining its attention. It had no shape, no eyes, but it was seeing, tasting the sacrifice. The transparent boy did not scream. His vocal cords had been altered, only able to produce high-pitched harmonics that made the brass instruments in the room vibrate sympathetically. The entity's attention was drawn to the boy. His luminous body began to flicker violently. One last time, his clear eyes found Shamashidi's. In them, Shamashidi saw a terrible understanding of what was about to happen. And beneath that understanding, a chillingly calm acceptance. Then his body began to disintegrate. Not a dissolution, but a dissolution. He turned into a shower of green light, slowly falling into the endless darkness of the pit. There was no sound, except for the clanging of metal and a contented murmur from the depths. The first ritual was complete. The high priest turned to look at Shamashidi, who was shivering not with cold, but with terror. He smiled behind his mask. "Perfect," he whispered. "You are finally ready for the festival." Above ground, Babylon was a sea of rejoicing. The Akitu, the new year, was in full swing. The people donned their finest clothes, hung garlands of flowers, and poured into the streets to watch the magnificent processions. The drums beat loudly, a rhythm of life, of rebirth, celebrating the great victory of Marduk, the god of order, over Tiamat, the goddess of chaos. They were celebrating an order they believed to be established forever, a security protected by the gods. Little did they know that this security was built on a foundation that was about to collapse beneath their feet. Underground, in uncharted chambers, those drums could be heard as well. But here, they were not sounds of joy. They were the beats of a clock counting down to doom. Each beat seemed to hasten the transformation of the remaining boys, a cruel reminder of their impending doom. Shamashidi's spine seemed to twitch with each beat, and the green glow on his skin grew stronger, almost blinding. The priest's plan was to perform 2 secondary sacrifices first, to warm the gate before presenting the main sacrifice, Shamashidi, on the culminating night of the festival. The boy with the transparent skin had already been offered. Now it was time for the boy with the odd joints. But the chaos they were trying to control was not a predictable entity. It was cunning, and it had chosen this moment to plant a surprise seed. As the monks began to wrap the copper wire around the boy's disfigured body, as they began the initial chant, something unprecedented happened. The boy, who had been silent for weeks, suddenly raised his head and laughed. It was not a laugh of madness or despair. It was a clear, refreshing laugh, full of contempt, as if he had just seen through some great cosmic joke that the monks, for all their erudition, were completely unaware of. His laughter echoed through the stone chamber. It had a strange frequency, a rhythm that obeyed no rules. The bronze instruments began to vibrate violently. And then, with a whip-sharp crack, a long fissure appeared in the black stone wall. "Be quiet," one of the priests shouted, but the boy continued to laugh, growing louder and louder. Pull him up now," the high priest roared, recognizing the disaster. But it was too late. The boy's laughter had established a direct resonance with the portal. The pit no longer breathed gently, it throbbed. A blast of cold air, carrying the scent of interstellar space and burning ozone, surged from the pit. The blast swept over the 6 monks standing closest. They did not scream. They simply stood still, then fell together, convulsing, eyes rolling back, mouths foaming. When they awoke hours later, they were no longer themselves. They had been violently enlightened, their minds wiped away and replaced by a fragment of the chaotic consciousness from below. The incident had thrown all plans into disarray. The careful schedule, the 13 moon cycles, all of it had been rendered meaningless. The gate was agitated. It was unstable. It was hungry, and it was impatient. Tomorrow, the high priest announced after sending the mad priests away. His voice was hoarse with fear. "We cannot wait any longer. Ready or not, the ritual will be completed tomorrow." And that was when Shamashidi's body made its final decision. As if hearing its own death sentence, it began to self-destruct. His breathing became shallow and ragged, a dry crackling. The blue light on his skin began to flicker, fading. "He is dying too soon," a priest reported in alarm. On the night of the festival, as the drums above reached a fever pitch, the priest hurried Shamash-Edi into position. He was placed over the pit, copper wires anchored to his disfigured body. He could feel the eerie warmth radiating from below. The high priest, his dignity gone, began the final chant, a complex series of syllables that were said to bind the gods themselves. His voice faltered. The other priests joined in, their voices trembling too. Their rhythm was off. Fear had disrupted the ritual's required precision. The air in the room grew thick, hard to breathe. The symbols on the walls glowed brightly. The pit began to emit a low hum, growing louder. Attention from below focused again, this time stronger and more ferocious than before. It was ready. The high priest took a breath, preparing to utter the final syllable, the most powerful word that would complete the binding. In that moment, in Shamashidi's nearly disintegrating mind, a single image emerged, his sister's wooden bird. A strange sense of peace, a sense of release, spread throughout his body. He no longer felt pain. He no longer felt fear. The high priest uttered the last word, and at that very moment, Shamashidi's heart stopped beating. It was not a tragic death. It was a final, absolute act of rebellion. His body, tortured and transformed, refused to serve its tormentor's purposes. It chose its own moment to die. A leaden silence fell over the room. The hum from the pit died abruptly. The chant was complete, but it had hit a wall of silence. The vessel was dead. The flume had been broken. The bridge had collapsed before anything could cross. The high priest was stunned. He tore off his mask, revealing a scarred face and one eye that was white with terror. "No," he whispered. The priests rushed forward, trying to revive Shamashidi's heart. They poured sacred oil into his mouth, but it only gushed out. They pricked his vital points with bone needles. To no avail. Then a sound came from the pit. This time it was not disappointment. It was a roar of rage. A predator had been summoned, promised a meal, and then deceived at the last second. The pit began to vomit darkness. Not darkness, but a physical substance, a viscous nothingness, blacker than the starless night. It poured forth like a muddy flood, swallowing the light of the torches. Where it touched the bronze tools, they rusted and disintegrated in seconds. Whispers came from the darkness, not in language, but in intent and hatred. "Seal it! Seal it now!" The high priest shouted, his voice cracking with panic. But how can you close a door when you have destroyed the key? They had summoned chaos, and now it had come to reclaim its debt. The panic did not last. It was replaced by something even more terrifying, a silence of awareness. The high priest, who had stood frozen as the darkness swallowed his subordinates, suddenly stirred. Panic had given way to the cold survival instinct of someone accustomed to walking the fine line of taboo. He knew the ritual had failed miserably. The gate had been unbound. But now there was another gate even more important to close, the gate to truth. If word got out, not only would the temple collapse, but the order they claimed to protect would crumble. "Act," he barked, ordering the remaining high priests, who were shaken but still rational. "We have until dawn." It was no longer a sacred ritual. It was a crime scene cleanup, a military operation to erase history. The first order was clear: burn. Ancient scrolls, meticulous records of 13 years of selection and sacrifice, clay tablets that recorded the progress of each boy's transformation. All were thrown into the furnaces. The flames roared, devouring the evidence, turning names and pains to ash. They were trying to erase the very memory of the temple. Next came the tools. Bronze hooks, ceremonial blades, chains, all melted down in the temple's forges, turning into shapeless, mute lumps of metal. They demolished the cells, filling them with rubble. They tried to seal the central ceremonial chamber. They dumped tons of bricks and stones into the pit, but it seemed bottomless. The stones simply disappeared into the darkness, echoless. Worse, some of the terrified workers swore they heard the stones being thrown back up, hitting the walls of the corridors that should have collapsed. Finally, they resorted to tons of molten lead, pouring it into the entrances, hoping the weight of the metal would block whatever was below. And finally, there was Shamashidi's body. It was the most problematic. It was the indisputable proof of their failure, and it refused to be destroyed. When they tried to burn it, a green, noxious smoke was released, causing those who inhaled it to cough up blood and convulse. When they tried to bury it in the sacred garden, the ground seemed to swell and push it back. Finally, in disgust and desperation, they carried his disfigured body to the garbage pit behind the temple, where they discarded broken idols and substandard offerings. They buried him hastily under layers of broken pottery and animal bones, trying to disguise his grave as a pile of garbage. They buried their failure with the filth of the faith that had created it. Throughout that terrible night, while the most powerful men of Babylon were destroying, someone was building, almost invisible. It was Nia, a young handmaiden. She was the one who brought water to the boys, the one who cleaned up the tears and blood that no one noticed. Her eyes had seen too much, and tonight she saw it all. She knew that if she did nothing, the story of these boys would be erased forever. She crept into a warehouse filled with pottery clay. With a dull kitchen knife, by the flickering light of a stolen oil lamp, she began her work. Her hands trembled, but her will was as firm as stone. She was no scribe. Her handwriting was ugly and clumsy, but what she wrote was true. She carved the name of every boy she could remember. She carved what she heard through the thin walls, the screams, the chants, the maniacal laughter. "Your name is Shamashidi, son of a grain seller," she carved on one tablet. "They said you were chosen to serve the gods. They lied. You were chosen to be food." On another, "They seal the stones, but they cannot seal the screams." She had created her own archive, a book of the oppressed. As dawn approached, she began hiding them. Some were stuffed into cracks in the walls. Others were buried near the waste pit, where she hoped someone would someday dig them up. And some of the most elaborate she had smuggled into the temple's main archive, hidden among the boring lists of grain and lamp oil. She was planting seeds of truth, hoping that one day, in the distant future, they would sprout. The physical concealment was almost complete by the time the first rays of dawn broke through. But the curse cared not for stone walls or lead doors. It had been released, and it began searching for its first hosts. The priests who had been directly involved in the ritual were the first to fall. The priest who had closed Shamashidi's eyes began to see the boy's green eyes everywhere. He screamed and scratched at his face. The high priest did not die. His fate was worse. The curse kept him alive to witness the fall. His body began to change, his spine began to curve, his skin began to thin. He was becoming the very thing he had created. The temple began to breathe, more visibly, the walls rising and falling in a regular, sickening rhythm. At night, the remaining guards swore they saw the ghosts of disfigured boys gliding through the corridors, not out for vengeance, but simply walking, trapped in the final moments of their torment. The rot had taken root. The priests, the gatekeepers of order, had now become the first vessels of chaos. They had succeeded in hiding their crimes from the eyes of the Babylonians, but they could not hide it from the temple that had seen it all. And now that temple began to tell its story, not in words, but in madness and decay. The curse had begun to spread. The priestly cover-up was successful in one respect. The people of Babylon never learned the truth about the night of the failed ritual, but they did not need to know the truth to feel its effects. The curse, like an invisible plague, slowly seeped out of the sealed foundations of the temple and into the city's veins. The next 13 years were not a sudden collapse, but a slow decay, the lingering death of an empire. It began in dreams. Collective nightmares, terrifyingly similar, haunted people from all walks of life. Craftsmen dreamed of their hands being twisted into grotesque tools. Mothers dreamed of the clanging of bronze bells and their children being carried away by white figures. And everyone from beggars to nobles dreamed of dark, endless corridors and the feeling of something breathing down their necks. Babylon had lost its sleep. Then, the nightmares began to creep into reality. A famous weaver, who specialized in creating tapestries depicting the deeds of the gods, was horrified to discover that the figures on her latest tapestry had transformed themselves overnight, becoming distorted and writhing in pain. A court musician was playing a beautiful piece for the king when his lyre suddenly struck a discordant chord, forcing everyone in the room to cover their ears. More terrifyingly, sporadic physical changes began to appear among the people. A child was born with a strange curve in his spine. An old soldier found that the skin on his arm had become thin and almost transparent. Panic and paranoia spread. Neighbors began to suspect each other. Every small deformity was seen as a sign of a curse. Meanwhile, the central temple, once the heart of the empire, was now an empty shell. The high priest, now a miserable creature, half human, half monster, was imprisoned in his own chamber. He could no longer perform any rituals. His speech was a meaningless syllable repeated backward. The temple had lost its connection to the gods, or perhaps it had only one god left, the chaos it had failed to bind. The king, initially fooled by the story of the fire, could no longer ignore the fact that his kingdom was rotting. His blessed food was rotting. His prophets were babbling nonsense. And the scar on the wall of his throne room, the disfigured image of the boy, was growing more vivid, a daily reminder of sin he did not understand but felt the weight of. His power, once based on the divine support of the temple, now rested on an empty foundation. 13 years after that fateful night, when the Persian army of Cyrus the Great appeared on the horizon, they did not face a mighty empire. They faced a city exhausted, a people tortured by nightmares and doubts, an army that had lost all will to fight. The sentries on the walls of Babylon whispered that their spears seemed heavier with each passing day, and that the gates seemed to swing open to welcome deliverance. Babylon had not been conquered. It had simply stopped breathing. And that brings us back to Arash, the Persian captain, kneeling in the darkness of the cellar, still holding the clay tablet. Now the story comes full circle. As his team digs deeper, they find more, the bones of other boys, broken vessels, discarded like trash. They understand that this is not an isolated tragedy. It is a system, a production line of suffering that has lasted for more than a decade. The scholar who accompanied them spent days sorting and translating the tablets from the Maid Nia. Gradually, a complete story emerged. A story of systematic abuse, of faith turned into an instrument of cruelty, and of desperate cover-ups by the powerful. They read the names of Shamash-Iddi, of Marduk Nasir, and others. Thanks to an anonymous maid and a kitchen knife, names that had been erased from history were now returned. The last tablet they found, buried just above Shamash-Iddi's skull, summed it all up. It read, "Here lived a boy who saved Babylon by not dying properly. The priests sought to feed the darkness with his suffering. Instead, his untimely death disrupted their rituals and released the very thing they had sought to control. When Babylon falls, know that it was the freedom of his death that killed it. His name is Shamash-Iddi. Remember him, not as a victim, but as a key that broke in the lock, and in doing so, locked the gate forever." Arash stood up, brushing the dust off his hands. He had come here looking for gold. Instead, he found a story heavier than gold, a lesson written in bone and clay. The story of Shamash-Iddi and the Temple of Marduk is more than an ancient legend. It is an echo, a reminder of a sad and sickeningly familiar pattern throughout human history. An institution, whether religious or political, claims divine authority. They single out the most vulnerable, the children, and call their abuse honor. They build walls of silence out of fear and blind loyalty. And when that structure decays and collapses, they do everything they can to burn the records, to blame the victims, to rewrite history. But history has its silent chroniclers. The real hero of this story is not a king or a warrior. It is the Maid Nia, who had no power, no status, but only courage and a piece of wet clay. Her act of recording the truth, her act of resisting oblivion, is the real miracle. She understood that the only way to truly seal the gates of hell is not through rituals or prayers, but by telling its story, by naming evil, and by giving its victims their names. The gates beneath Babylon may have been sealed by the fall of an empire, but similar gates are always at risk of being opened anywhere. Anytime we allow power to go unchecked, when we accept silence in the face of injustice, and when we believe that the suffering of a few is an acceptable price for the greater good of the many. The breath within the walls of Babylon has finally stopped, but its story, preserved by a courageous woman, now breathes on its behalf, not as a curse, but as a warning. A warning that true order is not built by nurturing chaos in the darkness, but by drawing it into the light.